The post-loss radio transmissions, oddities, hearers, and data. One of the most intriguing aspects of Earhart's disappearance is the alleged post-loss radio signals heard from July 2nd to July 9th, 1937. These transmissions, if genuine, suggest Earhart and Noonan survived the initial crash and were able to broadcast distress calls for several days. However, they were largely dismissed as hoaxes or interference at the time, only to be reevaluated in modern analyses. Let's delve into the oddities, who heard them, triangulation efforts, and supporting data. Entities that heard the signals. Over 120 reports of signals were cataloged, heard by a mix of professional and amateur listeners across the Pacific and North America. Government stations, U.S. Navy facilities like Radio Wailupe in Hawaii and Radio Tutuila in American Samoa, U.S. Coast Guard headquarters in Honolulu and San Francisco, Royal Navy's HMS Achilles. Commercial stations, Pan American Airways, Pan Am, direction finding stations on Oahu, Mokapu, Midway, and Wake Islands. Radio stations like KGU, KGMB in Honolulu, and Amalgamated Wireless on Nauru. Amateurs and others. Licensed amateurs on Howland and Baker Islands, U.S. Department of Interior employees, private citizens including Mabel Larimore, Amarillo, Texas, Nina Paxton, Ashland, Kentucky, Dana Randolph, Rock Springs, Wyoming, Mrs. Ernest Crabb, Toronto, Howard Coons, San Francisco, Betty Klink, St. Petersburg, Florida, Thelma Lovelace, St. Stephen, New Brunswick, and others who tuned in on shortwave radios. These hearers ranged from trained operators to everyday radio enthusiasts, many reporting signals on Earhart's frequencies, 3,105 kilohertz and 6,210 kilohertz, or their harmonics. Triangulation and bearings data. Triangulation was attempted using radio direction finders, RDFs. Pan Am stations provided key bearings, Mokapu, Oahu. Bearings of 213 degrees and 215 degrees true. Midway, 175 degrees and 201 degrees true. Wake Island, 144 degrees true. Howland Island, south by southeast bearing. These 5 bearings intersected near Gardner Island, Nikumaroro, about 350 miles southeast of Howland. The U.S. Navy's Itasca and other ships couldn't get fixes due to weak or intermittent signals, but Pan Am's commercial RDFs, designed for airline navigation, succeeded. Oddly, some bearings were taken on carrier signals, unmodulated waves, which are harder to direction find, but were used when voice was unintelligible. Modern analysis using IcePack software, ionospheric propagation model, confirmed high probabilities, up to 99%, for signals originating from Nikumaroro reaching these stations, especially during nighttime when ionospheric conditions favored transmission. Oddities and anomalies. The signals had several peculiarities. Carrier-only signals. Many receptions were just a steady carrier wave without voice or code. Harmonic receptions. Amateurs heard signals on harmonic frequencies, multiples of 3,105 over 6,210 kilohertz, which skip long distances via the ionosphere unpredictably. For example, Betty Klink heard a frantic voice on a harmonic describing injuries and water rising in the plane. Poor Morse code. Only one Morse signal, July 5th, was noted with extremely poor keying, unusual since neither Earhart nor Noonan was proficient in Morse. They relied on voice, timing, and silent periods. Signals clustered during low tides less than 26 inches, when the Electra's propeller could clear water on Nikumaroro's reef, allowing engine runs to power the radio. Active periods, approximately 1 hour, were followed by 1.5-hour silences, possibly for engine cooling, Experiments showed overheating at 900 RPM. Content oddities. Messages included desperate pleas like, "We are down on an uncharted island," Larimore, "Noonan seriously injured," multiple, "Water's knee deep, let me out," clink, and references to New York City. Perhaps mistaking a shipwreck for NYC skyline. Voices were identified as Earhart's by those who knew her, but some were garbled or weak. Credibility and supporting data. Of 120 signals, TIGAR deemed 57 credible, 25 uncertain, and 38 not credible, hoaxes, inconsistencies. A credible beyond reasonable doubt (CBRD) category applied to messages with compelling content, like responses to dash requests, e.g. Itasca and HMS Achilles heard dashes. Probabilities from IcePack, 94 to 99% for many CBRD signals. These support the Nikomororo castaway theory. Signals align with low tides for engine operation. Bearings point there. Content describes injuries and a reef landing. Dismissed in 1937 as bogus. Recent studies, e.g. 2012 International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, argued dozens were genuine. This data adds weight to survival post-crash, fueling ongoing searches, post-loss transmissions, logs, hoaxes, and hope. The days after the silence. When the Itasca failed to make further contact with Amelia Earhart after 8:43 on July 2, 1937, the world feared the worst. Yet in the days and weeks that followed, hundreds of supposed radio signals were reported, some by professional operators, others by amateurs. Each raised a tantalizing possibility that Earhart and Noonan had survived the disappearance and were broadcasting for help. These post-loss signals form one of the most intriguing and controversial chapters of the mystery. If authentic, they suggest the Electra did not sink immediately, but came to rest on land or a reef where its radios could operate. If false, they are tragic noise that confused search efforts. Credible reports. Several logs from official operators deserve special note. Itasca logs, July 2nd to 3rd. The Coast Guard recorded attempts to establish contact well after Earhart's last known transmission. They logged faint signals, but none were confirmed as her voice. Pan Am bearings, July 4th to 7th. Pan American Airways operated high-frequency direction finding HF/DF stations at Midway, Mokapu, Hawaii, and Wake Island. Operators reported hearing signals they attributed to Earhart and even attempted bearings. At least 3 bearings crossed near the Phoenix Islands, including Nikomororo. Navy and Army logs, military stations in the Pacific and even in North America reported weak signals on Earhart's frequencies. Some noted voice transmissions calling for help. Amateur reports. Dozens of amateur radio enthusiasts, especially in the United States, claim to have heard Amelia. Many described a woman's voice calling distress on 3105 or 6210 kilohertz. Some even reported phrases like "down on an island" or "can't hold out much longer." These reports varied wildly in credibility. Some operators had reliable equipment and logged times carefully. Others may have been swayed by media frenzy or wishful thinking. Hoaxes and misinterpretations. The wave of reports inevitably included hoaxes. A few individuals deliberately transmitted Earhart's frequencies to draw attention. Others misinterpreted ordinary signals as Amelia's. This clutter of genuine, mistaken, and fraudulent reports overwhelmed authorities. The Navy's search grid expanded to cover thousands of miles. Ships steamed to false locations. Time, fuel, and resources were wasted. The possibility of authenticity. Despite the confusion, many researchers believe some post-loss signals were genuine. Key reasons. Signal characteristics. Several signals described by operators had qualities matching Earhart's known transmitter. Geographic bearings. Pan Am's DF bearings intersected near Nikumaroro, consistent with the theory that she landed there. Time frame. Reports came primarily in the first week after July 2nd, fading afterward. This matches the idea that the Electra's batteries could have powered transmissions for only a limited time before saltwater or tides disabled the equipment. The Nikumaroro connection. Supporters of the Nikumaroro hypothesis argue that these signals are strong evidence she landed on the reef. During low tide, the Electra could have rested on the coral flat. With batteries still intact, Amelia could have broadcast distress calls. As tides rose and waves battered the plane, the radios eventually failed. This scenario explains why signals diminished after the first week. It also explains why credible bearings pointed southeast along Noonan's 157/337 line. Solar activity and HF disruption. Radio communication in 1937 depended entirely on the high-frequency HF bands, the same bands that are most sensitive to changes in the ionosphere. While mechanical and procedural issues are often cited as the cause of Earhart's communication problems, there was also an environmental factor largely invisible to the flight crew: solar activity. July 1937, high solar activity. Earhart's disappearance fell during solar cycle 17, which was approaching a peak. Sunspot counts were elevated through the summer. Intermittent solar flares occurred across July, producing bursts of X-rays and ultraviolet radiation. These events could temporarily ionize the D layer of the ionosphere, directly impacting HF propagation in daylight. When the D layer becomes over-ionized, lower HF frequencies, like Earhart's night frequency of 3,105 kHz, can be almost completely absorbed. Daytime F frequencies, like 6,210 kHz, can also suffer partial to severe signal loss. This can cause sudden HF blackouts lasting minutes to hours, with no warning to operators in 1937. How solar flares disrupt HF radio. HF radio works by bouncing signals off the ionosphere to reach beyond line-of-sight distances. During strong solar flare activity, 1. The sun emits X-rays and UV radiation. 2. These waves ionize the D layer of the ionosphere. 3. Instead of reflecting HF waves, the D layer absorbs them, preventing them from reaching distant stations. Impact on Earhart's flight, Itasca's side. Even with a strong transmitter, their HF signal could have been degraded by ionospheric absorption in Earhart's daylight path. Earhart's side, her Electra's HF transmissions, especially on 6,210 kHz, could have suffered partial or complete absorption during key communication windows. Result: what looked like a radio failure could have been a combination of equipment and antenna limitations, frequency selection mismatched to solar conditions, and HF blackouts triggered by solar flare events. Why this factor is overlooked. In 1937, space weather forecasting was primitive. There were no daily solar reports for aviators. Even experienced radio operators on Itasca would have attributed loss of signal to equipment or procedural problems, not solar activity. Today, we understand that space weather can cause complete HF blackouts. But at the time, this was essentially invisible. Balanced view solar activity alone cannot explain Earhart's disappearance. However, it is a credible contributing factor to her failed communications. It could have degraded or eliminated her ability to receive bearings. It could have prevented her position reports from being heard at a distance. It adds a layer of environmental complication to an already challenging flight. Between July 4th and July 7th, Pan Am operators logged several signals they believed came from Earhart's transmitter. Notably, Wake Island Station reported signals on 3,105 kilohertz and attempted bearings that pointed toward the Phoenix Islands. Midway Station also took bearings consistent with a source in the Phoenix group. Mokapu Point, Hawaii, logged bearings that crossed with the other two, again near Gardner, Nikumaroro. At least 3 separate bearings from 3 widely spaced stations intersected in the same general area. For radio triangulation, this was compelling evidence. The technical challenge. HF/DF in the 1930s was far from perfect. Signals could bounce off the ionosphere, creating false bearings. Static and interference were common. Taking a precise fix required skill and sometimes luck, but Pan Am's operators were among the best. They were accustomed to guiding clippers across the Pacific with paying passengers aboard. Their bearings were taken seriously. Implications of the bearings. If the bearings were correct, Earhart's signals originated near the Phoenix Islands, more than 350 miles southeast of Howland. This matches the theory that, after failing to find Howland, Noonan followed the 157/337 line southeast, reaching Gardner Island, Nikumaroro. Supporters of the Nikumaroro theory see the Pan Am bearings as some of the strongest evidence for that scenario. Critics argue the bearings were too imprecise to be conclusive. They point out that radio propagation at HF is notoriously tricky, especially at night. Multi-path reflections could have skewed the data. Additionally, no ship or aircraft at the time managed to confirm Earhart's presence in the Phoenix group. Later researchers have re-examined the Pan Am logs with modern knowledge of HF propagation. While uncertainties remain, many conclude the bearings were more than coincidence. Independent stations pointing toward the same general region strongly suggest a source there. If not Earhart, what else could have been transmitting on her frequency at that time? For the Pan Am operators, the experience was haunting. They believed they had heard her. Faint, intermittent, but distinct. They knew their bearings intersected in the Phoenix group, yet they also knew the Navy was not acting decisively on their data. The sense of frustration was acute. They may have held the key to finding Amelia, but the opportunity slipped away. The Pan Am RDF geometry remains one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the case. To some, it is a near smoking gun that Amelia survived the disappearance and landed at Nikumaroro. To others, it is a technical red herring. But whatever one believes, those lines drawn from Wake, Midway, and Hawaii to the Phoenix Islands are a reminder of July 1937, a world straining through static, listening for a lost aviator, and perhaps, just perhaps, hearing her voice. The challenge of 1930s radio. Amelia Earhart's disappearance cannot be separated from the limitations of 1930s radio. High-frequency HF communication was cutting-edge but unpredictable. Operators depended on atmospheric conditions, sunspot cycles, and the quirks of their equipment. Signals might carry thousands of miles one night and fade into static the next. Earhart's Lockheed Electra carried a Western Electric 20B transmitter and a 13C receiver, powered by the aircraft's 24-volt battery system and engine-driven generator. On paper, this gave her global reach. In practice, it proved tragically unreliable. HF propagation and the sun. HF propagation depends heavily on the ionosphere, layers of charged particles created by the sun's radiation. At night, lower layers fade, and signals bounce farther. During the day, higher ionization can absorb or scatter them. Sunspots and solar activity further complicate the picture. In July 1937, solar conditions were moderately active. Propagation predictions suggest her 3,105 kilohertz nighttime frequency was usable, but during daylight, the higher 6,210 kilohertz band was more reliable. Unfortunately, Earhart and Itasca were not perfectly coordinated in switching bands, leading to missed opportunities. One of the great puzzles is why the Itasca heard her loud and clear, while she seemed unable to hear them. On the evening of July 1st, Itasca's radio room was fully manned. Operators were briefed on Earhart's communications plan. She would transmit on 3,105 kilohertz at night and 6,210 kilohertz in daylight. Her Electra's Western electric transmitter was not designed for easy frequency changes outside these allocations. Frequency mismatch. The Itasca often transmitted on 7,500 kilohertz, a frequency her receiver could not tune. July 2nd. The morning unfolds. Shortly after sunrise on July 2nd, the Itasca's watch began hearing Earhart's voice. At 7 o'clock local time, a clear signal came through. She reported weather conditions, part cloudy, in a calm, professional tone. The strength of the signal suggested she was close. No position report was included. At 7:42, the second major call came in, more urgent. We must be on you but cannot see you. Gas is running low, flying at 1,000 feet. In the radio shack, the operators recorded the transmission. The signal was strong, almost booming in the headphones. Yet there was no sight of the Electra from the ship or Howland's shore party. The Itasca transmitted replies immediately. Most were on 7,500 kilohertz. This was standard Coast Guard practice. For years, cutters had used 7,500 for voice contact with aircraft. But the Itasca's radio team knew Earhart had been transmitting on 3105 and 6210. Without switching her receiver to 7500, she would never hear them. The ship did attempt 3,105 transmissions occasionally, but the logs show these were not consistent. This mismatch was a critical breakdown in the chain. At 8 o'clock, another strong call came in. Again, no acknowledgement of Itasca's replies. At 8:30, more of the same. Then, at 8:43, the transmission that would become central to the mystery. We are on the line 157337. We'll repeat this message on 6210. The line of position, referred to by 157 over 337 degrees, was a celestial navigation concept. At sunrise, Noonan had taken a sighting and established a line running northwest to southeast. If they couldn't see Howland, the plan was to search along this line. Northwest ran into empty ocean. Southeast led toward the Phoenix Islands. The Itasca's operators logged the message. Replies went out, still largely on 7,500. There was no response. This was the last confirmed voice transmission from Earhart after 8:43. In the hours that followed, Itasca's operators continued to monitor. Faint carrier signals were noted. At times, static suggested possible voice fragments, but these were weak and often unreadable. Here the story takes on another layer of intrigue. When comparing Itasca's working radio logs to the Navy's final transcript, researchers have noted differences. The working logs include marginal notes, quick jottings by operators that reference weak carriers and suspected transmissions outside the main entries. These marginal notes do not appear in the Navy's clean transcript. After the search, Commander Thompson gave careful statements about the Itasca's role. He acknowledged the lack of two-way communication. He defended the use of 7,500 as standard procedure. He suggested that Earhart's inability to receive them may have been due to technical issues with her receiver or a misunderstanding of frequency assignments. The battery debate. For years, some dismissed post-loss radio reports by arguing the Electra could not have powered its radios once the engine stopped. This view held that if she crashed into the sea, the plane would have sunk quickly, ending transmissions. But the Electra carried 24-volt batteries capable of powering the radios, at least intermittently, if the engines were shut down. If the aircraft landed on a reef or flat surface, its electrical system could have remained usable for days. This possibility explains why credible radio signals were reported for nearly a week after her disappearance. Low tide could have exposed the Electra enough to allow transmissions. High tide could have swamped the aircraft, gradually destroying its systems. Sunspot cycles and their role. Later researchers have looked closely at solar activity records from July 1937. The sunspot cycle was near a peak, which increased HF variability. At times, long-distance propagation would have been enhanced, enabling faint signals from the Pacific to be heard in North America. At other times, signals would have faded rapidly. This variability fits the pattern of the post-loss reports: scattered, inconsistent, but occasionally strong. Lessons in communication. The tragedy of Earhart's radio troubles is not just technical, it is human. Misunderstandings about frequencies, reluctance to use Morse code, removal of equipment for weight savings, and lack of rehearsal with Itasca all combine to create a fragile system. At the moment of crisis, that fragility turned fatal. Modern perspective. Today, HF radio remains important for aviation and maritime use, but satellite communication and GPS have largely replaced it. In hindsight, it is easy to criticize the limitations of 1937 technology. Yet for its time, Earhart's equipment was state-of-the-art. The real lesson lies in coordination, the importance of shared frequencies, redundancy, and training. Earhart's inability to hear Itasca was not due to one failure, but to a cascade of small missteps amplified by the unforgiving nature of HF propagation. Why it matters. The debate over whether her radios could have functioned after the disappearance is more than academic. If they did, it strengthens the case that some post-loss signals were real, pointing toward Nikumaroro. If not, those signals must all be dismissed as hoaxes or mistakes. In the end, the mystery of Amelia Earhart is as much about invisible radio waves as it is about oceans and islands. If you enjoyed and were fascinated with what you watched, then please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.